Ave Maris Stella.
Hello and welcome back to Vatican II in a Year. This is your host, Father Matthew Schneider. I am a priest of the Legionaries of Christ, and I teach theology. This is a podcast on the StarQuest Production Network at sqpn.com. Today we're on day 256. We're covering Ad Gentes 16 on moving from a mission to a particular church. For those of you who, like me, study a lot of computers, 256 is a very important number. It's 2 to the power of 8, which is what a byte is in your computer. And computer science people are like, yeah, that's very important. Anyway, so if you want to follow along, we have a reading plan and more details at sqpn.com/Vatican. Yesterday we spoke about religious and catechists. Catechists are a great help to mission, and various forms of religious life should be present in mission areas. Today we're starting chapter 3, which is titled Particular Churches. Now, before we cover this chapter, I want to make a little brief definition of what we mean by particular here. Particular does not mean unusual or something like that. No, particular means the local church, the church in this diocese or this region of the world or things like that. We can talk about the local church of the United States or the local church of Hartford or the local church of even sometimes down to a parish. But it just means the particular church here just means that local church as opposed to the universal church. And it's just in opposition to the universal church. But just so you're aware, I do not like the word particular here. When I speak, I usually use the word local rather than particular. But the Vatican document uses particular, and I'm not going to go around and change the words of a Vatican document. Today, the summary is we need to work from mission areas to establish self-sufficient local churches. So chapter 19 has 5 subparagraphs. I'm going to read them in 4 parts. A church is established once there's a population and a variety of local ministers and ministries. B, Vatican II reforms apply to mission areas too. C, live the universal church and particular application and the relationship between those two. And then D and E are mission areas need vocation and money from established churches. So let's begin with 19A. A, the work of planting the church in a given human community reaches a certain goal when the congregation of the faithful, already rooted in a social life and somewhat conformed to the local culture, enjoys a certain firmness and stability. That is to say, it is already equipped with its own supple, perhaps still insufficient, of local priests, religious, and laymen, as endowed with these institutions and ministries, which are necessary for leading and expanding the life of the people of God under the guidance of their own bishop. So this paragraph is trying to give us a very brief definition, distinction of what the difference is between a mission territory and a particular church. It's talking about that stability. They have their own priests and things like that, their own religious from the local area, whether that be, a diocese or a region, because oftentimes religious communities go across the whole region. And so this is important. We need that stability. We need to adapt it to the local culture. It's not just the foreigners who are there, right? For example, when a lot of the Catholics started coming to the U.S., they would bring their own priests from Germany or Ireland, and they would still be a German or Irish parish. And then as time went on, a lot of those German and Irish parishes turned into the local parish in the town or the parish in that part of the city and things like that. And they really became much more particular church and not just an outpost of the Irish or German Catholics in Ohio or in Chicago or something like that, or in some little town somewhere else. And so that's important. And we have these local ministries as well, not just these priests and religious, but local ministries as well. So now moving on to 19B, Vatican II reforms apply to mission areas too. So let's read it. B, in such new churches, the life of the people of God must mature in all those fields of Christian life which are to be reformed by the norms of this council. The congregation of the faithful become daily more aware of their status as communities of faith, liturgy, and love. The laity served by their civic and apostolic activities set up a public order based on justice and love. The means of social communication are put to wise use at the opportune time. By a truly Christian life, families become seedbeds of the lay apostolate and vocation of the priesthood and religious life. Finally, the faith is taught by an adequate catechesis that is celebrated in a liturgy of harmony with the genius of the people, and by suitable canonical legislation introduced into upright institutions and local customs. So, this subparagraph seems to be a little bit all over the place, but how I see it is kind of putting this idea of the Vatican II reforms here in the first sentence here, the reforms, and noting that all these different areas are areas where the reforms of Vatican II also affects these mission areas. So we have, new communities of faith and love, that idea of the people of God that we have in Lumen Gentium and terms like that. How do we use the media? Do we use the media for the church? Do we have a liturgy? How do we do our apostolic activity? How do we have vocations? How do we do those local things? And how do we adapt to local customs? And here, there are notes that local customs, for example, in liturgy are different. I will see videos occasionally of African Catholics doing something that just would not quite work in our culture. There are things like liturgical dance, because dance had a different role in that culture, and it's very different from the kind of liturgical dance you'll try and do in the United States, which tends to be kind of romantic, because most of our dance in the cultures we come from is a romantic thing, not a kind of worshiping God thing. And so liturgical dance doesn't work in our culture. But in many cultures, it does work. Now, that's important in how we adapt. Now, moving on to 19C, it's talking about living the universal and particular application. How do we link these two? Because we can have where from the particular where it has this universal application and things like that. We had, for example, the Divine Mercy, which was very a Polish thing for the first few decades. And then John Paul II was elected Pope, and all of a sudden it got spread all over the world. And now the Divine Mercy Chaplet, which was a kind of Polish thing, is now pretty much universal in the church. So those are the kind of things which might come up in this situation. But let's read 19C. The bishops, in turn, each one together with his own college of priests, being more and more imbued with the mind of the church and of Christ, feel and live along with the universal church. Let the young church keep up an intimate communion with the whole church, whose tradition they should link to their own culture in order to increase by a certain mutual exchange of forces the life of the mystical body. Hence, stress should be laid on those theological, psychological, and human elements which can contribute to fostering this sense of communion with the universal church. So this is this idea that is important when we link our local practices and our universal practices and the local church to the universal church. And this happens even in the mission territories. It seems a little easier in our own culture where this is kind of very straightforward, very much expected. But when you're doing a mission, you might have some new custom that's not super common. It might be something that's a little less expected, but it's still something that the church wants to have. And we want to keep that universal tradition in the local culture. And there is an exchange between these. Like I noted with Divine Mercy, where that was a local thing that became universal. And other times there's been other things that have started out in certain areas and then spread out and become very helpful for building up the church. Now, moving on to our last two subparagraphs, D and E, they talk about the mission territories need vocation and money from established churches. This is obviously not the goal. The goal is to set them up as that, but it's worth noting that those of us who, for example, in the United States, we have a very relatively rich church compared to most of the church in the world. Yes, we still struggle with money at times in the church, but compared to, say, the church in Nigeria or South Sudan, the American church is very rich. How are we doing? What are we doing with that money to help support the missions? So let's read these two subparagraphs. D. But these churches, very often located in the poorer portion of the globe, are mostly suffering from a very serious lack of priests and of material support. Therefore, they are badly in need of the continued mission activity of the whole church to furnish them with these subsidies which serve for the growth of the local church and above all for the maturity of Christian life. This mission action should also furnish help to those churches founded long since which are in a certain state of regression or weakness. E. Yet these churches should launch a common pastoral effort and suitable works to increase the number of vocations to diocesan clergy and to religious institutes, to discern them more readily and to train them more efficiently, so that little by little these churches may be able to provide for themselves and bring aid to others. This summary was pretty accurate, I think. It's talking about how we need these churches they need vocations and they need material support. Material support means money and other aids like physical objects, whether maybe they're not sending money, but they're sending the supplies to build a hospital or something like that, right? And that would still be providing material aid. And what we do have also is this idea where some of the old churches are regressing and they need vocations and money from elsewhere. Usually what they need is vocations, and there is a practice right now in the church that is not totally wrong, but can be abused, where a lot of these poorer churches send priests to help out these church places where the faith is regressed, but they have a lot of money, and those priests help fund a lot of the ministry activity back home. Whereas we in the richer areas should be giving that money without, oh, it's conditional on you providing us with a priest or something. And that's not the best way to do it. I'm not saying it's immoral, but I think we can do better. And finally, the goal is that self-sufficiency. They build up their own church, they build up their own vocation, they build up their own money, and every little one can take care of itself. Obviously, there's a lot of parts of the world that are still mission territories, even in the U.S., as we noted with Father Andrew when we did the interview to start this. So, thank you for listening to this episode of Vatican II in a Year. I do this podcast on a volunteer basis, and my local religious community relies on donations to pay our bills. If you want to support my community, you can go to patreon.com/frmatthewlc. There's also a link for that Patreon and for a one-time donation on my website, frmatthewlc.com. You can also donate to support StarQuest at sqpn.com/give. Tomorrow, we're going to continue with the next paragraph of Ad Gentes, which is paragraph 20, on everyone has a role in sharing the gospel. Please join us then to learn more about Vatican II, which can provide a blueprint for the Catholic Church. If you want more information on the podcast, like playlists for individual documents and a reading plan, go to sqpn.com/Vatican, frmatthewlc.com/Vatican, or Vatican SQPN on Facebook and X.
Amen.